So I am Sebastiano, I am a GD, I work for JetBrains on IntelliJ stuff. So today we're going to be talking about Compose and specifically how do you use Compose when you're not using the material design stuff that comes with it. Today we're going to be looking at a few things. First of all, do you need to use material or should you just ditch the material stuff that you get for free and go your own way? Then we're going to be looking at what the building blocks of Compose are, what are the parts that make up Compose, and which parts we can use when. We're going to be seeing at how theming works, how it's generally implemented. We're going to be seeing how you can actually write a good API in Compose when you're making your own composables. And this is the part that you can also reuse if you're not specifically doing a custom theme, but maybe you're just doing your own composables. And then we're going to be seeing how to create custom composables. And along the way, I hope I'm going to be providing some useful tips that you can reuse in your daily life. Again, even if you're not really implementing a new design system from scratch. Before we get started, there's a very important link that should be live now. All the links and references for today's talk are going to be on that website. So you have a couple of seconds to take the URL down if you need. And whenever you see that symbol somewhere in a slide, that means that there's a link at that URL that you can refer to for some more information. All done? All done? Yes. Okay, let's get started. So, material design. What really is material design? Well, we're all Android developers, we know what material design is, but specifically when we're talking about Compose, material is the default design system that is implemented in Jetpack Compose. And when you use Compose, most of the time you're probably using the material components, which are implementation of widgets that comply to the material specs. And for this reason, for many people, material and Compose UI are kind of the same thing, because when you're thinking about, oh, I'm going to do an app in Compose, you're actually thinking I'm going to do an app using the material Compose stuff. There are actually two material versions, as you probably know right now. The classic, old one, if you want to call it, is material theming, which is also known as material v2, which is the one that we have been using for a few years now. And then with Android 12, we saw the introduction of material U, also known as material v3. The current state of v3 is in Compose specifically a bit incomplete, and I would call it a bit alpha, so your mileage might vary on using that. You probably want to use a combination of v2 and v3 if you really need some stuff that is only v2. But material is really cool. First of all, it's very well documented. So there's a whole website that is material.io where you can find all the specs for material theming. And there's m3.material.io where you can find all the specs for material U. And those are really good resources that you can always refer to if you have any doubts on the implementation or just the styling of things. Material is also implemented in a way that makes it very flexible. There's a lot of ways where you can customize the colors of your composable easily. And then you can also change the way the shapes look in your composables. For example, the default might be rounded rectangles, but I don't know, you want it more rounded. Maybe you hate rounded corners and you just want it square. Maybe you're a Battlestar Galactica fan and you want to cut off the corners. Maybe you want something in between, just cut one corner off because that's all you can afford. I don't know. And then you can also very easily change typography across the whole application by using the typography facilities that Material provides. So maybe you don't like that font, prefer this one, that's good. Maybe you're a weird person and prefer Comic Sans. Sure. And the flexibility that Material provides makes it so that in many cases, it will be enough for you. You don't need to go custom too much. And if you only need to do some visual tweaks to what Material provides, you're probably fine with what is there already. You don't need to go and reinvent the wheel. But there are some cases in which this will not work out, specifically when you're trying to change the way the composables work. because the material implementations have opinionated behavior. So if that behavior does not fit what you're trying to do, then it might be easier to go your own way. And also, material design has some semantics, such as the idea of surfaces, elevation, the way it uses color. So all those things might not be compatible with your theme. And if that's the case, then again, probably going custom is a better solution. Because there's a few talks on this topic at this conference, there's a couple in particular I would like to recommend. One is Maya's talk, which is about integrating Compose into an existing application. Unfortunately, unless you have a time machine, you should have watched that yesterday, or wait for the video to drop at some point soon on the DroidCon website. And then this afternoon, there's a talk from Ryan. Yes, you're Ryan. That is also about custom design systems in Compose, although Ryan is not specifically talking about completely custom themes, but rather all the options. So I will be very specifically talking about one of the things, but Ryan will cover the others as well. And that's today at 3:20 p.m. OK, so we've seen material. What about other design systems? What just generally happens is, well, the designer will hand you a spec. I mean, I hope you have designers that you work with, because otherwise your life will be a bit complicated. But one day you get to work and you get a message, it's like, yo, implement this. And you're like, wait, what? And then you're like, yes, we were supposed to be doing this. Yeah, that makes sense. Sure, I'll get on it. And then you get maybe a Figma link, maybe Zeppelin, I don't know, whatever it is. And you get a list of the components they're supposed to implement. You will get information about the typography that you're supposed to be using, all the styles, the color palette, and a number of other things. And you will look at it, and probably going to look very nice. And then you're like, so where do I start? Like, it looks good in Figma, but how do I get it on the phone? Well, the first choice you have to make, again, is whether you really want to use material stuff and customize that, or start from scratch. And the way you decide that is you need to understand whether the design system that you get to implement is compatible with material. What does that mean? So what I recommend is looking at what components you get in material and what components your design system has. If they look similar, if they behave in a similar way, then you probably can just get away with customizing material. If there's a lot of stuff that is different, then that's when you start thinking, OK, maybe I can do something like I can hack around the material stuff to make it work the way I want it to work. But then how many hacks do you need? Is that too many? What is too many? But in general, I think look for visual and behavioral similarities between the components you have in your specs and the specs you have on the material design side. If they look like they could work, then it's great. If at all possible, again, I recommend reusing material because, well, it's much easier. It takes less time to reuse stuff that already exists and just customize it, especially because it's meant to be customized. And it's also battle tested. There's also a hybrid approach of sorts where you can say, I'm going to take some material stuff and some custom stuff and make it work together. That arguably is more difficult than making something entirely different, because then you have to make sure that the material stuff and your stuff are always in sync and the themes don't disagree on what's supposed to happen at some point. Now, because this is a talk about a custom design system and implementation, then we are assuming that you do not want to use material. Well, I have good news. If you remember doing this with the views system, that would have been a big problem because that was a big monolith, and you could shake it as much as you wanted, but it's not going to break apart. On the other hand, Compose is a very modular thing. And yes, I know some of you will be thinking that's the Windows logo. No, that's the Windows logo. The colors are in a different order. And also, these days, that's the Windows logo. So no, it's not the Windows logo. OK, so we were talking about, I got distracted. We were talking about getting rid of material. OK, that's gone. It's fine. How do we do that? Well, we open the build file. We look for the line that says material. We take it off. That's it. Well, most of the time. Sometimes, unfortunately, that's not that easy, because sometimes you might have something like a dependency that depends on material and will transitively bring it back into your code. And I mean, you could tell Gradle to just exclude the material group, but then those dependencies would not work. So what you can do instead, and my recommendation is at that point, is to tell the IDE to pretend that material does not, in fact, exist. And you can do that with a very nifty feature, which is to hide packages from auto-imports and auto-completion. So the code will still compile, material will still be on the class path, but you will not be able to use it effectively unless you manually go and type everything in by hand, which, let's be honest, nobody does unless they're using VS Code. And if you want more information on this feature, you can just go on the IntelliJ Web Help. The link is going to be, as usual, on the website. OK, so we were talking about components and Compose being a modular system, and we have taken out one of them, which is material. OK, it's gone. But we were saying that all the stuff that we use is in there. Oops. So all those things that you would normally use, and I'm sure all of you have used in the last week, at least one of them, you don't have them anymore. So, ouch. And it's not just the composables that you're missing. You're missing things like ripples. So ripples are a very material thing, and probably your design system will not be using ripples. Good news is, if it does, ripple is sort of separate from material, so you have a separate mini dependency that can bring just the ripples back, which is good. But it's not the only thing you lose. You also lose some useful APIs and concepts. For example, there are some composition locals, and we'll see in a second what those are, that material provides. But good examples of those are, for example, local content alpha, which is a way to say to your composables, your alpha should actually be 0.5, so the contents will be halfway transparent. Or maybe you can say with local content color, text, for example, you shouldn't be black, you should be blue. Da-ba-dee-da-ba-da. And then there's local text style, which is, again, you get the gist. The idea is that you can just use these composition locals to tell the content of your composables how to look. And in this case, we might want to make everything bold. But we have lost a lot of good stuff, but we will rebuild. And we will rebuild upon Foundation. Foundation is the superhero of this talk. It's going to be your best friend if you ever have to do this. And to understand why it's important, I'm going to be looking very briefly at how the text composable works in the material package. So this is text. This lives in the material package. But text, if you command-click it and see how it works, it's delegating to basic text, and basic text lives in Foundation. Then you get carried away, you continue command-clicking, and you see that basic text builds upon layout, which is in the UI component, and then that, in turn, depends on the runtime from Compose node. Now, you don't really need to care about the bottom 3 layers as much, but the point is we have taken out the top layer, but we can just redo that top part. We don't need to redo the whole thing. And that's the power of Foundation. You get 3/4-ish of the work done for you. Sometimes it's like 9 out of 10 parts of the work done for you, which is great. So the great thing about Foundation is that it allows you to never have to start from scratch. You are provided the basic building blocks that you can use to create your own composables. And that's, in fact, how Material works. Material is essentially taking Foundation and adding some extra stuff on top. And you can do exactly the same thing. In particular, in Foundation, you get a bunch of useful things, such as some basic layouts, box, row, column, spacers, whatever. You get some modifiers that are they're not tied to a specific build system or, design system. They're just generic concepts. You get the lazy layout, so lazy column, lazy row, the grid, the lazy grids, the experimental lazy layout. And then you get a bunch of bare composables, such as image and canvas. Those are universal. And you can customize them if you want but also you get a bunch of foundational concepts, such as, for example, scrolling, interactions, visual stuff. So all those things you kind of get for free. So if you can just build your own design system on top of these existing things. Now, how would you go and actually implement a custom theme? Well, again, material is a good starting point because we should be treating material as our study materials. It's a gold reference for implementations of themes in Compose. There's been a lot of work to make it the way it is now. There's been a lot of head bashing that you don't have to repeat. You can just see what the folks at Google have ended up doing. And the fact is, unfortunately, that because it's very flexible, sometimes it's also fairly complex. So obviously, to implement features, you need more code, and when you have more code, then things get a bit more complicated. But you don't need to take everything. Just take the stuff that you actually need for your design system. And it's not just about the code, but also the concept and the patterns that material has. They can be applied to your own theme as well. And some things that material does, they might not be in foundation, and you might need to re-implement them, but most of the time, that's fairly easy. You can just copy-paste it. It's OK. So I mentioned earlier composition locals. Now, this is a very important concept for theme making because it's a foundational one. Composition locals are a way in Compose to provide values for some definition of this. They are a way to inject an implicit dependency into your composition. And they're very useful for cases where you have some piece of data that is used by most, many, or all of your composables. So you don't have to pass it as a parameter to all of them all the time, which would get very annoying very quickly. Let's see quickly an example of a composition local. So a theme that you use in Compose is essentially a glorified composition local provider. A composition local provider is the way you set up a composition local and provide the value that will then be read by the contents of it. So in this case, for example, we are creating the local content color composition local. This is going to be a mouthful. Local content color composition local. And then we say, OK, this will provide black whenever it's read by the contents of the composition local provider. So we are scoping as well the value. And then whenever the value is read by the composables inside of the scope, then the actual value is injected in. Theming, in general, is built around composition locals. It's a very, very powerful tool that you use to define your composable behavior and appearance. And the fact that it's scoped to part of a composition makes it even more powerful. Now, we have seen that the theme is going to be a composition local provider, and the theme lives, let's say, at the top level. So the scope of a theme is going to be a composition local provider that encompasses everything. But you can also be more granular and have just some parts of your composition that are affected by maybe a different value because you want to do what the theme overlays would do in the view system, for example. A word of warning, these are implicit dependencies that you're injecting around. It's very powerful, but it's also a very good foot gun that you have to be careful using, especially when it comes to injecting values that are not part of theming. I would strongly recommend against using composition locals for that. Composition locals make sense for some stuff, but should really never be overused. Another important concept in theming that we see in Foundation and also implemented in Material are indications. Indications are, as the name suggests, they indicate something. In particular, they indicate the state of a composable. Like we have here a box with just a background, pretend that's a button, and it's idle, but then we also get with the, for example, clickable modifier, we get an interaction source, which I'm not going to cover because it's another topic, but think of it as a source of events that are click events, keyboard events, that sort of stuff. And it will tell you, oh, now the user, because you maybe are on desktop, has the mouse on top of your composable, so you can react to that. And the point of the indication is to provide a visual indication of the state change. Maybe the user clicks. That's also something that you can use indications for. Or maybe they just have been tabbing around and they ended up with the focus on your composable. That's also something that you can use an indication to display to users. And this sounds a bit abstract, but you are very familiar with indications because in material, that's ripples. A ripple is an indication and provides a visual state to all of those states. Indications in general are nothing more than something that draws in front or behind the content of your composable. And they are generally provided by composition local. There is a local indication, composition local. I know, I'm aware it's a lot of repetition. I cannot do anything about that. If you want to implement your own indication because your design system requires it, I recommend that you start from default debug default debug indication, which is an internal thing in Compose, but you can command click into that, copy paste it, and it's very basic, but it shows you how to detect whether the user is clicking, for example, or hovering over, and how to draw stuff at that point. It's fairly easy, and it's a great starting point. Okay, we have the basic concepts nailed down, and now we're getting to the point where we can actually do stuff. But it's always good to make sure that we are all on the same page when it comes to the design of the APIs and the composables that we are writing. There are some official documentation and guidelines that I strongly recommend that you folks read. They're based on the Kotlin coding conventions, and they're really good. I really like them because they always provide an explanation on why something is some way or the other, or why it's not done in a certain way. They are, again, it's a very strongly recommended read. Even if you decide not to go with it, at least you should know why they went that way, and then you can make up your mind on why you won't go that way. It's based on years of experience, which is something invaluable, and it helps with making your API consistent, which in turn, because your APIs will look the same way as the base, foundation, compose, material stuff, then you will meet the user's expectations, and then you will make your user's life much easier. Now, it kind of feels obvious at this point, but composables and Compose are called this way because you build a UI composing things together. And the way you do that is you provide your composable that is supposed to contain some other content, you provide that other content as a composable in turn, which is generally a lambda, a composable lambda. If you want to be very fancy, you can call it a higher order function. But we are not here at a functional conference, so we're just going to say those are functions that take functions as parameters. There's something to be said about variants, and this is something that you can see in material as well. If you have a component that has different variants that are semantically different, then the recommended approach is not to have a parameter that says this variant or that variant, but to model them separately as separate composables. This way you keep flexibility and also keep it very clear that you're using specifically something of that type instead of something of the other type. And in material, you can see that, for example, with the distinction between button and text button. A button is a button that has a background. The text button is a button that is only text. So they're the same thing. They behave the same way, but they look different, and they have different meaning, and they're used in different scenarios. So that's why they're separate. I recommend reading a really good blog post from the Compose team, I think by Matvey. You can find the link for that. It explains all the design thinking behind how we ended up with this sort of API for button. Another important concept that Material uses, and I strongly recommend you adhere to as well, is slot APIs. So it's a pattern. And again, there's another blog post by Chris Baines that you can refer to, which is very interesting. It explains the hows and whys of that. But To narrow it down and condense it as much as possible, the idea is that composables should only do one thing, and then you pass in the contents to your composables as if you had some pre-made slots where you just say, oh, there I want to put this, and there I want to put that. So these slots for subcomponents are providing the styling automatically, so you do that, you inject the values that you need via composition locals, and then you probably also want to provide some pre-made components that users can use. This makes your API more flexible because you are not mandating the visual aspect of the contents, but also easier to use because if someone wants to do the default thing, then they can just use the whatever pre-made component you have done. If they need something custom, then they don't need to hack things around. They can just pass something else. And a good example of this is scaffolding material. Scaffold has several slots that you can fill in. One is the top bar, the other one is the bottom bar, and then you also have the floating action button and some others. But the idea is that there are some places where you know your content is going to be, and material also provides a top-up bar composable that does the default stuff. But if you want something else, you can just, instead of using top-up bar, you can use an entirely different composable, and that's fine. And likewise, you have bottom navigation for the bottom bar, and you have a concrete floating action button implementation. So the basics are there. If you want to change anything, you can very easily. One last principle I want to talk about is scoping. So when you're creating composables, some composables, some modifiers only make sense in certain situations. If that's the case, then you should use scoping to make sure that people don't misuse them or use them at the wrong time. How is scoping done? Well, in general, like any DSL in Kotlin, you use receivers for your lambdas. So then you can say, oh, my function, my modifier, my whatever is only available in this certain scope. That's very abstract, so let's look at some examples. One that you definitely have seen is box. So box has a so-called box scope. So when you're inside of the content lambda of a box that has a box scope as a receiver, you also get the align modifier. Why is it there and not generally available? Because align only makes sense when you're in a box. So that's the scoping I'm talking about. And similarly, for lazy layouts, you have lazy list scope that provides things like the way you define an item. That stuff would not make sense anywhere else apart from inside of a lazy layout. So that's why scoping is cool. One last time, use material as reference. There's so many things that you can take from them. And I know I'm repeating this over and over because it's very, very important. Most of the time, you're going to find that the basics are the same, even though the result is different. And again, copy-pasting is not a bad thing. If you see something in material that you need, but you don't have any more because you've dropped material, just steal it. Obviously, remember, you should simplify things whenever it's possible. And this is not just limited to code and composables. Copy the patterns as well. For example, a pattern I really like is that whenever a material composable takes some colors as parameters that can override the color that is specified in the theme, they have a default value of color.unspecified. This way, if you don't actually pass a color, then the composable know, oh, actually, well, the user is fine with whatever comes from the theme. And that's something that does not just apply to material, that applies to anything. So it's a good pattern to copy, for example. And I mean, we're talking about a custom theme, so you probably won't need the entirety of material, because otherwise you would just use material at that point. It really depends on the design system and on the criteria that we saw earlier. But a concrete example could be, you might think about indications, and maybe you have buttons that don't change color when you press them, but they go down. So in this case, you don't really need an indication to do anything, because the button just goes down, and that's probably implemented in the button itself, not by the indication. Obviously, you have to remember that there are other cases, such as focusing and hovering, where an indication might still be useful, but then that depends again on your design system. Okay, kind of running out of time, so let's talk about making the composables. So let's pretend for a second that I work at Duolingo. I do not work at Duolingo. I just want to make it very clear. I say pretend because I don't work at Duolingo. But I really like their design language, and I think it's a very good example of if I were working at Duolingo, then I would probably go custom because their design language is different enough from Material. Okay, so we are at Duolingo. We get the specs, and we need to start somewhere implementing the stuff. And usually, I don't know, I would start from button, because button is simple, understandable. So we look at the spec, and the spec looks like that. We have a normal state, we have a press state, we have a disable state. There's probably going to be others, but it's good enough for now. And now we get philosophical very quickly. What is a button? So a button is something you can tap, right? You can click it. And now this is the time where my repetition should bring you to think, okay, what does Material do? How is it implemented in Material? Well, in Material, a button is a surface that has, at some point, a clickable modifier. Well, that's not hard. I mean, you don't have access to surface, but surface is a box. It's just fancy. It looks fancy, but it's a box that has a color. So if you get a box and you make it clickable, button, done. So my button looks like this. And just quickly running through it, well, again, poor man's surface. We have the clickable, because it wouldn't be a button if you cannot click it. And then we do some stuff, and for example, we have a composition local provider where we set the content color. And this is something that I copied one-to-one from Material because it makes sense for my implementation of the Duolingo design system. So again, you can copy-paste stuff from Material. That's OK. And the same thing happens to set up the text style inside of a button. Material does it exactly the same way. And it also uses a row. And it also, well, no, I do something different here, because otherwise I would just be using a normal Material button. I actually have some custom logic to draw the background of my button. But you see, of all this stuff, the only really, truly custom thing is the way I draw the background. The rest is essentially the same thing the Material is doing. And then just chuck some content in, done. OK, that felt like cheating. It was too easy. Let's look at something a bit more difficult, text. Text is a pain, because you have to deal with laying out the text. You need to figure out where glyphs go. And then maybe you're dealing with a language that also requires shaping. So what is shaping? Is when you put two letters or two glyphs next to each other, and they change shape because they really like each other. And then you have rendering, which is also a big problem. And this is not even thinking about stuff like emojis and different fonts and spans and whatnot. This is just a basic idea of text rendering. But what if Compose made it easy? Well, it does. Because you have basic text. You will have noticed that if you were paying attention earlier, that text in Material delegates to basic text. How much does it delegate? Well, basic text is the whole implementation of text except the theming part, which is the part we're actually interested in customizing. And that's the power of this whole thing in Compose, is that if you look at how Material text is done, it sets up the text color by reading the values from the theme. It sets up the style by reading values from the theme and just chucks it to basic text. And it's like, I'm done, bye. So my text look surprisingly a lot like the Material one. And if you look at the Material implementation, you will see that the only difference I have is the way I read the value of the text color and the style. Actually, I'm lying, because that also looks exactly the same, because after all, the way Material does it also makes sense for me, so why wouldn't I do it the same way? OK, that was too easy. Let's look at something harder, editable text. It's more difficult, because it's not just static stuff. You also need to care about selection. You need to look at the cursor position. You need to care about copy-pasting and a number of other things that are more difficult. And it is, in fact, much harder to do in Compose. No, it's not. It's the same thing. It is exactly the same thing. You get a basic text field, which does 98% of the work for you, and you just need to do the theming stuff. And it would look like this. This is the Material implementation. And yeah, the only thing you really need to do is provide the decoration and the box for your text field. What do I mean by that? That's a text field. Someone typed something somewhere, but there's no decoration around it, there's no box. So that's the part that you provide, because that's the part that belongs in your theme and not in Foundation. So for example, maybe your theme says, oh, my text fields have a line underneath, or maybe they have a border around them. I don't know. And then there's stuff that is called decoration, which is things like icons, backgrounds, all that sort of stuff, hints, prompts, whatnot. All that stuff that you get in Material, you don't get with basic text, but you implement your own, and only the stuff you need. You don't need to implement everything. Okay, one last example. Something that is not provided for us by Foundation, progress bars. There is no built-in composable in Foundation for progress bar. And the reason is that it's, well, the way Material does it is it draws it by hand. A progress bar is just a track and a progress. It's just two draw calls. So what we're going to be doing is drawing to the canvas, but it's pretty easy. The only thing we need to remember is that there is a difference between left to right and right to left layout directions, so you will need to start from one side or the other. If we look at how progress bar looks in Duolingo, there's a track, there's a progress, and there is a highlight on top. So that's the fancy stuff that you get on top. So, okay, usual pattern. We look at how it works in Material. You can see it's a canvas, which is a composable that draws to a canvas. And the important thing is it draws the background and it draws the bar. Done. Okay, so what do? We do exactly the same thing. We take a canvas, so we can draw stuff by hand. We apply the progress semantics modifier, which tells Compose, I'm a progress bar, because otherwise it's just a random bunch of pixels that don't mean anything. And then we cheat. Why do we cheat? If we look at the progress bar and we get closer and closer, if I draw that as a rounded rectangle, as I get closer to 0, I get to the point where it's a straight circle. And if I go smaller than that, it's going to look like shit. Because rounded rectangle is trying to not look terrible, but by not looking terrible, it kind of looks bad in our case. So what do we do? In this case, what I'm doing is I'm setting a clip in the rounded rectangle shape, and instead of starting to draw from 0, I start to draw before 0. So whenever my progress comes in, because I'm already beyond, so the minimum decent looking shape is the circle, and it's always there. What I get is that the progress comes in and doesn't look like crap when it does, but it looks the way it's supposed to be. So small distraction, but this is the kind of thing you might want to have to do, well, you might have to do to implement your design system. Okay, so what's next? We draw the background. It's just a rectangle because we have clip. There's no point in making it rounded. And then we calculate the size of the bar, and then we draw it, and then we do the same thing for the highlight. We calculate where it is, and then we draw it. Okay, easy. I have been saying a lot of times, look at Material, take the stuff you need, drop the stuff you don't. Don't overcomplicate things. The Material button has 15 parameters. I don't even know how many it has. But if you don't need them, drop them. If your theme doesn't need to be flexible on some aspects, don't. Make your code easier. Take only the stuff that you need and allow your users to only touch that. And that's very important because it's going to make your life a lot easier. In our example, well, Duolingo doesn't have different shapes. If I'm implementing the Duolingo design system, it's always rounded rectangles with rounded corners. So it's done. So you can just use whatever normal shape you have, you hard code the values, it's always the same. It always comes from the theme, and you cannot override it. And yeah, the only thing you need to pay attention to is the layout direction. Last thing, accessibility. Never forget accessibility. It's very important. It's not one of the corners you want to cut out. And it's all about semantics. I'm not going to go into details, but essentially there's a semantics modifier that you specify the role of your composable to. such as button, progress, like we saw, progress semantic is essentially doing that under the hood. And then you go and test your stuff with screen readers, because otherwise some of your users might not be able to use your app, which sucks. There's documentation that you can refer to, and there's talks from Google I/O from last year and from this year. Okay, what have we learned today? We have learned that we study material and we use foundation and we are as efficient as we can, trying not just to only take the stuff that we need, but also make it work in the best possible way. And if needed, we will cheat, because UI is about cheating. And then, no. Yes, use the patterns that have been established in Compose. They have proven to work out, so they will work out for you as well. And with that, done.